your moderator today. If you have questions as we proceed with the talk, just enter those into the chat box and I'll monitor that and try to insert your questions in appropriate places. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. Ken Pigg is Professor Emeritus of Rural Sociology at the University of Missouri. Scott Chazdon is an Evaluation and Research Specialist for the Center for Community Vitality at the University of Minnesota Extension. And Lena Etuk is a social demographer for Oregon State University Extension Service. And I'll turn it over to you now.
Good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to this webinar. We've been very pleased at the support we've gotten from the Center for this little project, in which we've been trying to determine what all of us together have learned from the work that we've been doing on research and evaluation of community leadership development education. This is the project group, and I want to give our thanks to all the participants. Mary Emery at the top of the list has been our convener and coordinator for this project, and we want to extend special thanks to Mary for all the work she's done, especially given her transition from one institution to another. And take special note of the participation of a couple of folks from the leadership learning community out on the West Coast, as well as I guess they have an office on the East Coast as well. But all of these folks have been quite active in participating and lending their input to this process. The objectives of this webinar are threefold. First, we want to review what we have learned from recently completed research and evaluation projects regarding community leadership development programs. Each of the three presenters today have been involved in the conduct of one or more recent projects, and we'll start by reviewing these briefly as background to the challenges we'll present as part of the second objective, what we have learned from the present practice. And finally, we'll discuss some of these challenges with you as we invite your input. We certainly don't feel that we're able to cover everything in this webinar, so your input will help us as we close this project and complete our efforts to produce a white paper which summarizes the learning that comes out of these various studies that we've been reviewing. I'm going to start with a review of the project that I have been conducting along with Stephen Gasteyer and Ken Martin. Stephen is from Michigan State and Ken Martin is from Ohio State University. We did a piece of research with the last 5 years. It was funded by USDA under the National Research Initiative. It was a 36-site study. We matched those 36 sites on a viability index that we created. We used 24 treatment sites where they had active community leadership development education programs, with 12 comparison sites in 6 states. The comparison sites did not have an active leadership development program. We generated a list of over 1,000 participants from those educational programs, and with a snowball technique, the names and contact information for about 250 community leaders in the comparison sites. We conducted a online survey with about a 62% response rate for all the participants and the community leaders in the comparison sites. That survey established participant effects and produced a structured model of 6 indices. Why is that important? Well, ordinarily a survey of that type that measures 6 outcomes typically treats each of those outcomes as individualistic or unique outcomes. We decided there might be some relationship among those 6 and did an analysis which produced a structured model with civic engagement and social cohesion being the distal outcomes, the ones that that seem to be the result of the other outcomes, such as personal efficacy, community knowledge, and community commitment. So we find that the outcomes that we have been thinking about and measuring as part of individual level outcomes of these programs are not just independent, but they are in fact related. Secondly, we conducted a study then to look at community effects, where we looked at community projects and activities with our measurement focused on the elements of the community capitals framework. And we were able to make that linkage using civic engagement and social cohesion and produce statistical evidence that there was significant change resulting from our leadership development programs. We also were able to determine that participation produced broader and deeper involvement in community associations as a result of their participation in leadership development education, and that the time devoted to participation in these programs was a direct and important factor in the educational strategy related to the outcomes. Scott, why don't you take the next slide?
All right. So this is, whoops, I went too far ahead. This is Scott Chazdon in Minnesota, and we have been involved in a lot of evaluation activity for the past several years, evaluating our community leadership programming. Our community leadership programming in Minnesota has been going on for over 2 decades and has followed a fairly consistent curriculum. And when I came to Extension about 6 years ago, we were already doing quite a bit of pre and post surveys of the competencies that people were gaining from participation in our community leadership programs. We were using the survey tool that Pigg had developed at Missouri. And so we sort of think of our leadership evaluation in phases, and we started with that use of a retrospective pre and post survey that really measured people's competencies in a bunch of different areas, such as some of the ones that Ken mentioned: shared future and purpose, civic engagement, commitment to the community. There were several of those scales. We also have always measured the organizations that people are affiliated with and whether they're inactive members, active members, or leaders of those organizations. And we look at the actual change in those statuses from the beginning to the end of the leadership program. That's been tremendously useful information to collect over time. Then we started to ask questions more about public value. We have Laura Kalambakidis here at the University of Minnesota, who really tries to get us to think about the value of our programs to the people beyond those we directly serve, beyond our direct participants. So we started to think about the community effects or community impacts of our programming in leadership. And so in our first phase, we conducted follow-up interviews with the alumni of our leadership programs, with interview questions that were based on the Community Capitals framework. So we were asking people questions about the degree they think they had made changes in social capital and political capital, and we worded the questions so that they actually made sense to people with examples of types of changes that would be under the category of political capital, for example. And that was successful, and we did a report that we published on our website. But we felt like we needed to go deeper and not just talk with our direct participants when we do this follow-up interviewing. So phase 2 of our evaluation work added community stakeholders to the interviewing process. So we interviewed both our alumni and community stakeholders such as local elected officials or influential leaders, or even other informal leaders who are thought leaders in the community. People whose names we actually got from the participants in our program. So it's a little bit like a 360 kind of look at the way that those leaders that went through our program had influenced their community. And that was also a really worthwhile effort. We published some articles about that research. And then we thought, well, what's new? And we heard about ripple effect mapping, which is the Phase 3 effort. I was part of a webinar talking about ripple effect mapping for the North Central Regional Center last February. And it's an interesting group method of doing interviews with both participants and non-participants after a program has been completed, usually at least a year after the program is completed. So that ripple mapping is interesting because, number one, it's a little bit easier to pull off in terms of not having to conduct individual interviews with so many people. But perhaps more importantly, it's a participatory method where you're engaging members of a community and thinking about the successes and non-successes that came about because of the leadership programming, and energizing them to keep going and to keep doing more work. So that's a great aspect of the ripple effect mapping. So with that sort of summary of what we've done in Minnesota, I'm going to turn it over to Lena to talk about the programs, leadership programs in Oregon.
Great, thanks. So the Ford Institute Leadership Program is a Oregon-based effort to build rural community vitality, basically. And I'm part of an evaluation team at Oregon State University Extension Service that has been working on evaluating this program. We started our evaluation in 2007, and we're still working on it. So it's been a really large-scale, long-term effort to really understand what's going on with this program, what impact has it had. The program itself started in 2003 and is still going. Basically, the Ford Institute Leadership Program operates as a 5-year training program in communities. So they'll take the program to a particular community, and every year for 5 years they'll do a different training. So leadership development training, effective organization training, and then a community collaborations forum. And so the theory of the program, or the purpose of the program, is that by building community leaders and helping organizations become more effective through individual level training, communities will become more collaborative, so individuals will collaborate in communities as well as cross-community collaborations will result. But that as a result of that, rural towns in Oregon, and actually it also serves Siskiyou County, California, which is one of the most northern counties in California, that these rural towns will become more economically, socially, and environmentally vital. And they define that in very particular ways, but basically the idea here is that it's meant to have a big impact on the community. So our evaluation, so OSU's evaluation, has really sought to test the extent to which this theory is actually true. You know, to what extent has the leadership program built this type of vitality in communities? So we've looked at individual level outcomes, network outcomes, and community outcomes. And we've looked at these using different methodologies, surveys, focus groups, interviews, case studies, etc. And at the individual level, we looked for and have found evidence of increased knowledge, skills, and motivation related to sort of facilitation, communication skills, as well as civic engagement, so the desire to be engaged in civic life. But then also we've looked at organizational level knowledge. To what extent do people know and have learned how to operate and manage budgets, resource organizations, etc. Then we've also looked at the network outcomes, and that again was through surveys and focus groups, looking at how people are connecting, and we found that the leadership program actually has cultivated, that's one of its major outcomes, has cultivated really rich networks of people within these communities, people who didn't used to actually interact are now interacting as a result. And then finally, looking at community outcomes, we had to, we've again used surveys, interviews, and then also case studies to really understand that community level impact. And so we've been able to aggregate sort of the individual level outcomes and see that, well, these communities now have increased capacity because of these new leaders who've been trained. But then also these leaders, to some extent, have engaged in processes, community processes or projects to actually do something in their community that may have been within the context of the program, so a project that they took on as a result of the program, but it could also be that after the program was done, folks took on projects in their communities. And so through those projects, we've been able to gauge the extent to which actual economic, social, or environmental changes have actually occurred in communities. And mostly we see that any of those sort of higher level outcomes have been mostly at the social and environmental level. So building skate parks, or building, improving the sort of downtown feel by adding flower baskets, for instance, and then some social outcomes as well. So that's really been the way that we've looked at this leadership program, and so that'll inform the discussion we have today. So now I'll turn it back over to Ken. There.
Okay, let's talk now about the 5 challenges that we think face leadership educators as we go forward. The first of these we divide into 2 parts. Basically, we want to talk about leadership development for what? And you notice that each of us have talked about the development of individual participants, the effects that leadership development education has on individuals. And we would propose that leader development is focused on this individual quality, individual characteristic development, cognitive, psychological aspects. These are an important foundation for leadership, but not the same as leadership. Leadership, we would argue, is a relationship among collaborators. Some would say leaders and followers. But we would argue that all activities provide opportunities for anyone or everyone to all act in a role as leader at some point in the process if they so desire. Leadership is an emergent property of a social and political relationship among people that share mutual purposes and intend to accomplish something that amounts to real change in their communities. Leadership development usually involves social structures and processes, some of which didn't exist before that leadership emerged. So leadership can be innovative and entrepreneurial or creative. As Heifetz says, leadership defines itself through action, as leadership is all about change. Drath argues that leadership is about direction, alignment, and commitment created by leaders and among leaders. These principles might even set the stage for the kind of leader development necessary to support leadership in community activities. On the other hand, leadership for what poses a question, are we doing what we think we're doing in these educational programs? The research that the group I'm with has conducted would indicate that leadership educators may be missing opportunities for real change in their communities by thinking in limited ways. Other programs have taken the approach that creating leadership can best happen in the context of a process of creating an action plan to address a specific community issue or challenge, with appropriate time set aside for support, for mentoring and coaching about leader development to occur during that process. The Leadership for Action program that is sponsored, I believe it's by Pew, is one of those examples. Even programs that stress the development of leadership capacity, however, need to ask capacity for what and for whom, and what kind of capacity is intended to be built. Often it may be useful to have discussions with your participants about this issue at an early stage of a program, with appropriate modifications made to the program schedule before you continue with the curriculum. This is a way of engaging people early on in what they want to learn and how they want to learn it, so that you can appropriately target the kind of leader development and the sort of leadership that you want as an outcome. Which brings us to the next challenge. Lena, you want to take over?
Well, and I might mention before we go to the next challenge that this leadership for what issue has led to some interesting developments in Minnesota's programming, where we have different types now of leadership cohort programs because of the different for whats. So we have leadership programs that are really more focused on organizations and leadership for the organization. And we have leadership programs that are all about bridging social capital and are within a county trying to really create and strengthen bridging social capital and connections between people in communities in a given county. And now we're developing programming, cohort programming that's more organized around civic engagement and an approach to civic engagement that we've developed based on an extensive review of the literature. So to a degree it also becomes a question of what do you label as leadership development, and what do our communities resonate with in terms of what they actually are looking for from us.
Right. So the next challenge that emerged based on the research that all of us have done on leadership development is really around who participates. So we all recognize the importance of diversity, right? Ours is a diverse nation, so it's really important that our leadership programs really reflect that diversity. But the question arises, sort of, what kind of diversity should we be seeking in these leadership programs? Well, our research actually seems to suggest that diversity is important because of the broad array of ideas and perspectives that can come to the leadership table and participate together. Typically, we use skin color, occupation, gender, income, these sorts of markers as indicators of the different perspectives and ideas that need to be integrated and involved in leadership development. So that presents some challenges. So I'll ask Scott to talk about the next point.
Right. So one of the issues that we've noticed in terms of this diversity of ideas is we took a look at the organizational affiliations of members of our cohort programs to see what social sectors or social fields of community life were people active in. And we looked at all the members of our cohort programs as a group to see how much cross-sector representation was there among the involvements of members of the group. And what we found was the more cross-sector representation, the better the results of our post-survey measure of shared future and purpose. So as part of a recruitment strategy, what we would recommend is recruiting people who are connected to a wide range of social sectors in community life. And that's another way of getting at this diversity of ideas.
Now, when we talk about diversity, we also have to be thinking about integration, and how do we integrate that diversity? Well, in Oregon, with the Ford Institute Leadership Program, they really have taken an integrated perspective most of the time. So we have in Oregon, despite our vast whiteness, we do have communities of color. We have Native American communities, we have Latino communities. Those are sort of most predominant, especially in rural places. So the Ford Institute Leadership Program, by and large, had an integrated perspective. They integrated Latinos and Native Americans in the white, typically dominated leadership development classes. But they've also recognized that oftentimes within communities of color that have typically been, without power, that sometimes it's important for them to have a separate space to learn some of these skills together as a group, because they come from a shared background and a shared culture, and then they can take what they've learned to then better interact with the dominant culture. So that's the approach that the Ford Institute Leadership Program has taken in Oregon, and I think to some success. But at the same time, we have to recognize that these people all exist in communities where they are more or less together, be they integrated or not, but they are working together. And so we have to be really careful about how we integrate or opt to segregate these different racial groups, for instance, or gender groups, or class groups, etc. So that's just a challenge that has come up in Oregon, and again, I'm not sure that there's been consensus with respect to is it better to have separate Latino groups, or is it better to integrate. I think it really depends on the community and that community's history and the issues that are facing the different members of those groups.
I think you're right, Lena, and part of that probably also depends on whether or not the leadership you want exercised will remain within the group, or whether it's in conjunction with members of other racial or ethnic groups or even gender groups.
Right.
So this integration issue is real important and needs to be addressed early. One thing I wanted to bring out here as our last point is that our research has shown that the demographics of the participants don't affect the individual level outcomes. The 6 indices that we use to measure individual level outcomes are not affected by things like age and gender and levels of education and income and so forth. Excuse me, they just don't have any effect on the explanation of the amount of variation in those indices. We interpret this in a pretty positive way, although as a sociologist it's sort of a mystery to me why I can't make that work. We interpret it as an affirmative action outcome. That is, that everybody who participates in these community-based programs basically experiences the learning in the same way, and so there's no differential effect based on any of these demographic characteristics, which is a good thing in one sense, although it makes you wonder why certain kinds of these demographics don't have any effect. Moving on to challenge number 3, I want to talk briefly about this first item. Cultivating an acceptable state of disequilibrium is a big mouthful, but basically what we're talking about here is making your participants just slightly uncomfortable, getting them out of their comfort zones so that they're taking a little bit of a risk in a relatively risk-free environment. I don't think this needs to take too much effort or be challenging in terms of your educational design. For example, a lot of people have not done very much public speaking. They've not had to take on the task of inviting an elected official to speak before their group, to conduct a panel session, to moderate a discussion, or some kinds of those kinds of things. And cognitive collective activities are another good way to create enough disequilibrium among individuals and the group for learning to take place. Our research shows that in various kinds of settings, physical challenges like ropes courses and those kinds of things, probably overdoing it, and they don't seem to resonate with participants as having very much to do with leadership development. Excuse me. Lena, you want to talk about projects for a minute?
Yeah, so in Oregon, the Ford Institute Leadership Program really has taken projects and integrated them fully and wholly into the process of the leadership development class. And so the project basically starts at the beginning of the class. They pick the project, and then once the class is over, after a 4-month period, the project then continues, so they have to complete the project. And so we actually found that this project was a great idea because it could provide people the opportunity to learn how to apply some of the leadership skills that they learned during the class, as well as learn about sort of how do you make change in the community, what processes do you have to navigate, what bureaucracies do you have to navigate in order to make something happen in your community. So it's a great learning opportunity. But on the other hand, it does result in some disequilibrium. The extent to which it's acceptable, that's sort of the issue. So sometimes what would happen is that folks in the class would want the project to be really big so that it could have a real impact on the community. But that would often lead to a really big project that might not actually get completed in the year that it was actually supposed to get completed. And then it would also sometimes lead to attrition of program participants, because it's a big project, takes a lot of effort. Folks are just saying, I really don't have time to be involved in this, so they exit. And then others might even feel like, I don't even agree with this project, I don't want to do it, so then they drop out. So when you have a big project that's supposed to have a big impact, then you have that challenge. So the Ford Institute Leadership Program actually sort of modified their approach to projects to sort of scale it down and really set some limits on what the project can actually be, to try to make it more about a learning experience and less about sort of an opportunity to have a big impact on the community. So, but then that had its own set of challenges associated with it too, because then some folks in the class really felt that the project should actually be impactful, and that taking on a small project really was a waste of their time. So sometimes those people would drop out, but mostly they would just kind of complain about it. That's been our experience. So in general, people then are able to learn from the project when it's small and manageable. But when it's big, the potential for community impact is there, but not as many people are going to be able to participate in it. So it's, again, you know, finding that acceptable state of disequilibrium. How much can you push people and challenge people? How much can you expect them to produce out of a project? And then what's the purpose of the project? Is it for learning outcome, or is it for a community impact outcome? So that's been our experience with projects.
Thanks, Lena. One of the things that our research has shown is that one of the individual outcomes that we measure is a shared vision and purpose. And yet when we went to the communities to actually look at the kinds of projects that were carried out by the participants after they graduated, there seemed to be no connection between those projects and anything that they might have gathered as learning from the leadership development programs that might have been related to that vision and purpose indicator. That indicator just had no effect in the overall prediction of the variation. So I think we need to look at how projects fit what we're trying to do in our learning designs, and see how those projects fit. Tacking them on just doesn't seem to work very well, as Lena said. Shifting gears slightly, I want to talk briefly about some other things that we've learned. One is that even community leaders who do not participate in formal education programs learn individual leader skills and knowledge. If you remember in my description of our research projects, we had 12 sites where we measured the effects of change from over a 5-year period in these indices for community leaders who did not have access to a leadership development program. Those measurements actually showed some significant gains in each one of these 6 indicators. Not as much as those who had access to a leadership development program, but it makes us appreciate the fact that experiential learning is an important part of leadership development, and we need to find ways to take advantage of that in our leadership development designs. We also learned that active learning designs in a program are more effective in producing outcomes than passive learning designs. By active learning, we mean things that are participatory, that get the participants involved directly in collaborative learning, in activities that force them to work together in various kinds of activities, not necessarily projects in the way we've discussed it before, but in various sorts of projects where they have to take on small responsibilities and follow through with that. Thirdly, some thought needs to be given to incorporating anticipatory learning into our programs, which is about selecting desirable events and working toward their completion. In other words, this gets back to our shared vision and purpose thing. If we can find a way to connect that shared vision and purpose to scenario building, even if we don't get to the actual project, thinking about where we want to head in some concrete terms and what it takes to get there, that might be a very useful addition to our programs. But this should also result in creating some new alternatives for the problems that exist in their communities and the issues that these face. Finally, tying these points together is the notion of relationship building, which is sort of like the networking that Scott talked about earlier, but it's a result that we want anyway. Collaborative skills for leadership, which is basically the definition of leadership. Further, through participation in these kinds of activities with other citizens, individuals learn to trust each other and to create networks they can rely on in the future for support and assistance. And this may be as simple as learning to trust that somebody's going to bring the refreshments for a particular session, that they're going to have the program ready for the rest of the participants to enjoy and learn from, and that sort of thing in the program.
There's a question from Jim Resick here about diversity along different types of communities on the rural-urban continuum. I guess that might be directed at Scott and Lena on some of the things that they were talking about.
Okay, you want to take a minute and address that, Scott or Lena?
Sure. Yeah, so in our program, well, not my program, but the Ford Institute Leadership Program, it was really focused on rural development, so there was no attempt to cross the boundary, integrate urban or more suburban folks into these leadership programs. But I think one of the ways that I would respond to this, and I'll obviously let Scott chime in as well, but I think I think incorporating that type of diversity can be really powerful if one of the purposes of incorporating that diversity is to build rural-urban linkages, and that's, I think, something that's becoming more and more salient in discussions that I've been in around rural development and really focusing on rural community change. So I think it can be really powerful. It just then means that probably your leadership program should be structured around building rural-urban linkages and building understanding across those two types of geographies. So Scott, Chazdon,
and our programs have mostly been rural as well, except that we do know, for example, in our bridging programs, the one program that started off all our bridging programs really happened because there was a primary urban center in the county where all the resources were located, and the rest of the county didn't have much say, and people who lived in the town didn't even know the rest of the county existed. So there's always that need to create connections among people. In this case, it was still a rural community, but it was a large center in the county, and they needed to be better connected to the rest of the county and the smaller communities. So we have done that, but not so much the big metro continuum that you're describing.
Jim, some of our programs that we evaluated were county-wide or even multi-county in some regards. And in a couple of cases, the diversity was really the diversity of ideas and the diversity of levels of issues that they were trying to deal with. So the community might be dealing with a water quality issue that affected them at the local level, and the county was trying to deal with a wastewater treatment system that affected the communities in that county. But they had very different ideas about how that needed to be done, and bringing them together created some opportunities for discussion around how do we make these two seemingly diverse objectives fit together so that they work. Now, that's not probably the kind of diversity you're thinking about, but those are the ones that we've had the most experience with. I think if we had online some of the folks from the leadership learning community that have worked quite a bit in urban and suburban areas, they could give you a little better perspective on this. But if you go to their website, just dial in leadership learning community on your Google search, and I'm sure there's some materials there that might get you some starting points. All right, if we can, let's move on here as time's starting to get short. I want to talk quickly about a thing I mentioned earlier, direction, alignment, and commitment as three principles for curriculum development under the heading, what should we teach? I think these three ideas from DRASP could provide a useful starting point for a very dynamic leadership development curriculum that would produce higher levels of civic engagement and greater social cohesion, making vision a more central and meaningful element in the model for community impact. Direction being provided by vision and purpose, Alignment means bringing all the parties together to share that purpose and direction. And commitment means developing a sense that we're all in this together and we all have a stake in the outcome, and we're all willing to make some effort to reach that outcome. We might not be tackling the same problem, but we know that even if we're working parallel on different issues, we're all headed in the same direction. In my view, each of these principles strongly suggest specific sorts of activities for learning that might be incorporated into a program learning strategy. And I emphasize the term strategy, that could produce a stronger, more vital civic structure and lead to greater material benefit to the community. Lena, do you have something to add?
Yeah, so in sort of surveying all of the leadership development programs that all of us have evaluated, so the three of us, but then also the folks that have been part of this think tank, it's been really apparent from our work that there are really three types of sort of leadership development content areas, and each is really so the three here are the skills for facilitation. That's one level of content. So how do you facilitate meetings, etc. But then also the second level of content is around how do we teach people how to communicate and work together well. And part of that is having good facilitation skills, but then part of that is a little bit deeper too. And so then that's skills, but then there's also access to the networks and ability to leverage those networks. And then finally, that third level of content relates to systems thinking, being able to think about issues, your community, as parts of a complex system, so that when you actually go about trying to realize change in any particular way, you're actually able to see, whatever it is that I'm trying to influence isn't just, there's not like a linear relationship between what I'm going to do and affecting that change. There are all sorts of other issues that are involved that just my effort might get actually drowned out by other issues that are going on. And so what we've been able to sort of ascertain from our research is that having each one of these content areas as your sole purpose or your sole element of curriculum is going to mean that your leadership development program is actually going to have a certain type of outcome. So if you really only focus on facilitation skills, then really what you're going to do is you're going to train facilitators, and they're going to be really good at facilitating meetings and making sure that people are able to communicate openly, but you're not necessarily going to be building the skills for folks to go change their community and impact like economic development, for instance, because you're just not teaching them those skills. So then in those programs that are trying to have that sort of higher level outcome or impact, like economic change or social change or environmental change, it would be really, it seems to us, based on our research, that it would behoove those programs to focus on not only facilitation skills and communication and collaboration skills, but also some of that systems thinking, so that people can really understand how they fit and what issues they need to address to realize an impact in their communities.
Thanks, Lena. You've heard both Scott and I talk about civic education as one of the outcomes and focus of some of the work that we've been doing. It's certainly one of the outcomes that we've given a great deal of attention to, and I think we could say that we're already doing a pretty decent job of producing this sort of outcome, but we're not leveraging it to create the sort of change that might make a real difference in our communities. I think we could be doing more in our leadership development education strategies. We need to be teaching people what community engagement, civic engagement is all about, how community politics really works, especially in their particular community. It means more than just campaigning and voting. It means things about how decision making works and how people might affect change in that process and in that structure that exists in their community. If they're going to create community change, they really have to know how that system is set up in their community, and if necessary, how they go about changing it. Scott, you want to talk about Challenge 5?
Sure, and just to mention a note about civic education too, I think times are changing in that people are not learning civics in their K-12 education anymore. So Extension may need to step up its role here and teaching people how formal government operates, especially at the local level, because it seems like people are not learning that. And then the last challenge, how do we know if it's working, is the sort of evaluation challenge. And Ken has talked about the multi-state research study that he's been involved with that focused on some pretty big summative questions about whether community leadership development really makes a difference, whether people whether communities that don't have it are any worse off than communities that do. So those big questions continue to be important ones to look at, and I call those the sort of summative evaluation questions. And I also really think the formative evaluation questions are key. We use the pre-post survey for all of our leadership programming. We try to have the same survey tool so that we can compare across our different offerings of our leadership programs and really gain lessons about, well, why did this particular program have a better result in terms of community commitment or community knowledge than some other program? That discussion ends up being very important for helping us think about what we're doing, what we're trying to teach, and how well we're accomplishing that, and has also led us to think about things like recruitment. And then Ken and I were both going to talk about the Community Capitals Framework as a very, very useful tool for thinking about those larger community effects. We've used that, as I mentioned, with our interviewing protocols, and we're using it as a way to code our ripple effect maps that we're producing. And Ken was going to talk a little bit more about how they use the framework in his big study.
Yeah, we've used it in two different ways. One, we have a dissertation that's resulted from our study by a student at Illinois in which she looked at the organizational data, coded all the specific organizations in the community according to the community capitals, and then looked at how participation was aligned with each of those organizational categories based on those capitals. We also used the capitals framework to organize data regarding the community projects that the leaders from these programs after they graduated got involved with. It was a way for us to understand the dynamic ways in which assets are related to each other among the capitals, how they get leveraged back and forth, and it was a way to capture the nature of community effects of leadership as well. So we were able to predict small amounts of variation in each of the capitals that we measured based on our individual level outcomes. Lena?
Yeah, and actually, I'll just address Godwin's question here as well, since it was addressed to me, but I think we can all sort of speak to it. So Godwin asks where we would put knowledge about the community and community development processes. I'm guessing within sort of the 3 levels of content, Godwin, I think that's correct. I would probably put it in towards systems thinking, but I think when we're looking at community development, when we're thinking about community development, it's not just about the process, but really also understanding what are we trying to develop in the community and understand the complexity around that issue. So I think I would lean toward that being placed in sort of the system thinking type of content level, but I'm not sure if others want to respond to that.
Well, I think that's fine. I think that's where I'd put it.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So then, so the last point that I wanted to address here on this 5th challenge and 5th and final challenge is really needing to focus on identifying the best sources of data. Typically, we turn to participants to give us information about how they are interacting with the program, what they've learned, what they've done since the program, etc. And that's a great source of data. But what Scott Chazdon and I have both found, and I'm sure others have found as well, is that talking to non-participants is also a really good source of data as well, because they have a slightly different perspective, right? You know, they're going to be from an outside perspective, but still within the community, and they'll be able to sort of keep keep in check what participants say is going on in the community. So they might say, oh yeah, this leadership program is responsible for X, Y, and Z happening in this community. But when we talk to non-participants, then we actually find, yeah, that leadership program had something to do with it, but you know, there were other people that were involved, there were other factors involved in the community. And when we look to those other sorts of data, sources of data, we can actually learn more about how community change happens and how leadership and leadership development plays a role. And that's really important information as we move forward in terms of evaluating these programs, because really ultimately many of us are trying to understand how can we make communities better, right? And so then the last point I want to make about how we know if it's working is really around measuring impact and aiming for impact that's actually attainable. And so when we are developing our programs, our leadership development programs, you know, we want to have concrete goals and goals that we can actually affect. So it's great for us to have a goal of, you know, because we recognize that currently right now our economy is, you know, still struggling along. We want to have an influence on the economy. We want to reduce unemployment, for instance. But we have to be honest with ourselves and developing our leadership programs that if we want to have an impact on the economy, then maybe we need to be teaching to that. Or we could modify our goal. We could say, you know, maybe we're not trying to aim for the economy. Maybe we are really going to be specifically around capacity building. So when we're building our programs, we have to have an eye on the impact that we want to have and have to be realistic about that. So I see there's another question down here. Okay, and Scott has explained that. So the next steps that we have identified, first and foremost, though perhaps not the most important, but one of the interesting next steps that we've discovered is that we really need to encourage program developers, the leadership development program developers, to really examine the purpose of your program, and also identify the theory that's guiding your program. So how is it that you think what you're developing or what you're doing in terms of your programming is actually going to lead to some sort of outcome or change? And then also align the purpose of your program with the strategy that you're going to use to get there. So if, again, if your goal is economic change, then make sure the strategies, your learning strategies, are aligned with that type of goal.
And then we think that's an important step to figure out what kinds of evaluation you're currently conducting, and are they getting you the information that you really need to improve your program? Is evaluation being conducted consistently across program offerings? Are you getting at these community level impacts, and what strategies might you use to get at those? And we've talked about a few methods that that can be employed to get at those community level changes that result from leadership programming. And Ken, I think you were going to talk about the third piece.
Yeah, just briefly, because I know our time is short. There are an awful lot of research efforts that we could identify and have identified to support learning and accountability. We've mentioned a few of those. The network effects haven't really been measured, although Scott has made an initial attempt with his colleagues at doing that. Recruitment effects, what are the differences culturally across different sort of diversity measures? What is the role of projects and how do they fit? If we took a different approach to how they got integrated into programs, how might that have an effect on outcomes? The public value notion of community effects rather than and other public values measures, particularly as it relates to economic development, which is a big issue, I know, for a lot of extension folks as well. And finally, the community capitals framework. We need much better measures, I think, for that framework to really be useful. Scott and his crew are making some good headway, I think, in that regard, but we need to get that out and get it shared in a way that's useful. We might even want to think together somehow about a community of practice on e-extension or something related to a subgroup of the leadership learning community as a way to begin to pull together some ideas and some common language, which is another barrier to really understanding what each of us are doing. So with that, let's open it for discussion, and I think Lena's going to moderate this discussion in the time we have left.
Yeah, and since we are limited on time, I want to make sure that everyone knows that the chat box is actually going to be recorded, and we'll be able to get that. So if you could put your email address in there, if you've got a question that you'd like us to follow up on, we can email you after the webinar. So basically, you know, we've talked about these 5 challenges today based on what we've learned from our leadership development evaluations. But we'd like to hear from you. You know, do these challenges resonate with your experiences as practitioners or evaluators or what have you? Are these the challenges that you've run across? But then the second question that we'd like to know is, are there other challenges that we've missed? Some higher level issues around developing leadership in communities that you've run across that we've missed here.
Yeah, I'd like to add.
So you gotta use the chat box.
If I may step out of my moderator role here. And while people are thinking about that and putting things in the chat box, I'll lead off with a question for the presenters here, and that is quite simply, you know, I think all of us who are on the line recognize community development generally and leadership development in particular as a multi-year process. You know, you don't necessarily see the full impacts of what you're doing, you know, 12 months after, or within 12 months, and yet we're all faced with, you know, these annual reporting requirements. So, you know, talk a little bit about that, and also in your experience, when do the impacts kind of tend to peak? You know, is it it's probably not 1 year out. Is it 2 years out? Is it 3 years out? Is it 4 years out? Is it 5 years out? And how do you capture those impacts that are, you know, kind of further or removed from the actual program in time?
Well, I can actually answer that one briefly. So we've been studying the Ford Institute Leadership Program for 5 years. So for many of these communities, they started in 2003 and it's now 2012, right? So they're like 10 years out. And even in those communities, I don't think we've fully seen the impact. So that's quite a while. So I think we're going to have to wait and see, and I think the best way to do that is through longitudinal analysis, and really making sure that the funder is aware of the fact that it's going to take time, and we have to keep with these communities and have to keep tracking it over time.
And I would say from our experience, I don't have a sense of the time frame, because I think as time goes on, we're seeing like the ripples continue in ways that then it becomes harder and harder. You know, this question of attribution versus contribution comes up a lot, and we, as time goes on, it becomes a little harder to even identify the piece that the leadership development program contributed to. But we do know, for example, when we do the ripple effect mapping, that it's very clear to identify a sort of chain of effects from the program to the impacts in the community, because the participants of the group agree that those things actually, that chain did happen. And the community capitals measures, Eric Kaufman had asked a question. There is one journal article where we published a list of our interview questions at the end of the article, and I can send that to you, but you can also Google, it's called Bridging. The article was about bridging Brown County, and the lead author is Rasmussen. Katie Rasmussen is one of our educators who I think is on this call. So you could Google that. It was published in the Journal of Leadership Education.
Eric Kaufman wanted to know how you got the participants and the non-participants to, you know, answer these questions. Snowball method, or?
I'm just sending him an answer.
Okay, right. Yeah. Okay. Great. So the short answer to my long question then is probably repeated evaluation.
That's the strategy we've followed. Yeah.
Scott, we've used a retrospective approach, usually 5 years after a program has been completed. I've tried earlier and later. 5 years seems to be a pretty good time frame. If you get much later than that, people don't remember what's been going on, and if it's earlier than that, not much has happened. So you really have to catch it in a time frame. Unless you've got the resources to actually follow an individual site year after year after year and document it each year, you really can't answer your question. And so far, I've never been able to pull together the resources to be able to do what you would like to have us do.
So a reasonable strategy might be to do kind of one form of evaluation immediately after the program's done. It's more of a knowledge inventory type of evaluation, or a participant satisfaction kind of evaluation, and then do the more in-depth one in year 5.
Yeah, that's been the way we've been doing it here in Missouri now for the last 10 or 12 years.
Okay, that's useful. Well, we're about out of time here, and I could ask people who haven't, since we've been talking about evaluation, it'd be nice if folks could fill out the webinar evaluation as well right here, and then these questions will be emailed to the participants. So if you've got some questions that you'd like to input into the chat box, go ahead. I think we'll have Rosa turn